Gentle-lady viewers and gentlemen viewers, good evening and welcome to this edition of our TV program, Historical Sketches. For most of us, when we say or think of Pisa, the image immediately coming to mind is that of its iconic leaning tower. And this is true of those who have not visited Pisa in person, but also for those who have. Pisa is but one of the stops among the canonical destination listed among things to see in Italy, along with Venice with her gondolas, and Florence, Rome and her Colosseum, Pompeii, and so on. In this episode of our show, we will speak a bit more about Pisa with the idea of placing the leaning tower into a slightly broader perspective than that of a tower which happened to become lopsided and that became famous for being so. Now, as you may know, the Tower of Pisa is part of a larger architectural complex that comprises the cathedral, the separate baptistery, the monumental cemetery, and the tower itself. Construction of the cathedral began in 1064 AD, 109 years later, before the beginning of the construction of the famous tower. These dates are historically important because the construction of this formidable complex of structures happened at the time when Pisa reached the apex of her power in the central medieval centuries, in the middle of the Middle Ages, so to speak. Now, there were 4 independent maritime republics in Italy: Pisa, Amalfi, which is near Naples, Genoa, and Venice. Perhaps the most famous of the 4 is Venice, which retained its independence until the year 1798, when Napoleon, who had conquered Italy, gave it away to Austria, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the Habsburg, as it was called at the time. When the construction of the complex began, Pisa had just acquired militarily the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, and Pisa had become an important international power, and it significantly contributed to the launch of the first crusade in the Holy Land. And in fact, the baptistery, of which we will talk in a moment, was styled after the building of the Sacred Sepulchre in Jerusalem. We know quite a bit about the Cathedral of Pisa complex thanks to the inscriptions that are engraved on the facade of the cathedral itself, all in Latin, of course. So, for example, under the sarcophagus, which is the tomb of the cathedral's architect by the name of Busqueto, it is written, "In the year of the incarnation 1006, 60,000 Sicilians, thanks to our strength, are conquered while they want to prevail against us, and they fall defeated. In fact, the Sicilian people, wishing to destroy our name, the name of Pisa, tried to reach our land. Therefore, Pisa, greatly troubled, did not hesitate to chase them inside their own borders. The city of Messina is witness to your enterprises, the city that saw all those Sicilians dead, victorious. After the carnage, the Pisans returned home unscathed." It almost feels as if we were reading an account of the Middle East wars. But it should be noted that much of southern Italy at the time of our historical sketch was Islamic, so that the conflict, we would say, was both a conflict of empires and a conflict of religions. Today we would call it a conflict of civilization. The content of the epigraph is greatly exaggerated. Pisa's fleet could not possibly transport an army of 60,000. But what is interesting, however, is the style and what we would call today, what we would call the attitude. Pisa considered itself master or mistress of the Mediterranean, and if Obama had been president of the Republic of Pisa, he would have said that Pisa could intervene in any part of the known world, the known world of the times, whenever her interests were threatened. One of the other epigraphs explained that the initial financing, we would call it today, the financing for the constructions of the cathedral, the baptistery and the tower, came out of 6 ships laden with riches, which the Pisans sank in Palermo, the main harbor of the Sicilians, or if you like, of the Muslims. Symbolic of the riches removed from Islamic Sicily, there remains today this particular griffin. And whoever produced a text for these epigraphs had a certain penchant for the grandiose. One of the inscriptions says of the architect of the cathedral, as we said, Mr. Boschetto, that his genius exceeded the genius of Ulysses and of Daedalus. Ulysses, says the inscription, became famous because, thanks to his Trojan horse, destroyed the city of Troy, or helped to do it. But Boschetto, the architect, was able to build these magnificent works. The same reasoning applies to Daedalus, who constructed the famous labyrinth. The labyrinth was nothing but a black house, but Boschetto built a temple who could stand any comparison. Not only that, but Boschetto even defeated the devil. In fact, the devil caused the wreck of a ship which transported huge monolithic columns for the central nave of the cathedral. But Boschetto, thanks to his, it says the inscription, thanks to his extraordinary machines, succeeded in recovering the columns from the bottom of the Tyrrhenian Sea. And in another inscription it is reported that our hero, Boschetto, made 10 young girls lift what 1,000 oxen could not have done, could hardly move. All this to the extraordinary master, thanks to his extraordinary mastery of levers and pivots. It was also rumored that the same Boschetto was involved in the positioning and the erection of the obelisk in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican, an event which took place in 1586. And now a brief digression connected with the erection of the obelisk in the Vatican. It was Pope Sixtus V who, wanting to decorate St. Peter's Square, as we all know, ordered it to transport the obelisk into the center of the square. Beforehand, the obelisk was situated in one corner of what is called, still today is called Nero's Circle. And it had been transported there from Egypt by the will of the Emperor Caligula, who was the emperor who made a horse a senator, blazing a trail of great political wisdom, at least according to the critics of the current political system. Transportation of the obelisk, as you can imagine, was no easy feat. And the engineer, which was called Domenico Fontana, made long calculations and assembled an array of scaffolding and winches and pulleys, and 800 men were involved, and 140 horses were employed in this project. Order was given to the crowd to be completely silent during the operation, on penalty of death. Why? To the point that an executioner and gallows were brought in on the site in case they were needed. Now, the obelisk was almost in place when the ropes began to stretch and give way. And there was a real danger that the obelisk would collapse, fall to pieces. But in the silence, someone yelled, "Water to the ropes," in his Genoese dialect. And this courageous speaker was a sea captain by the name of Benedetto Tresca, who, due to his profession, knew that hemp ropes shorten when they are wet, and that advice saved the day. The sea captain was arrested, but the Pope, in recognition of his contribution, actually gave him privileges, gave him a pension, and a pension to him and to his descendant, and to allow his descendant to supply the Church of St. Peter with the olive branches needed for the celebration of the Holy Week. End of this digression. And back to the cathedral and the baptistry and the tower. The construction of the whole complex took altogether, believe it or not, 331 years, from the year 1064 to the year 1395, when the statue of John the Baptist was installed on the top of the baptistry. The first architect, Busqueto, whom we've already met, he was the one who was better than Ulysses and Daedalus, died in 1110, and in 1152 there began the construction of the baptistry under the direction of another architect by the name of Dio ti salvi, God save you, translated as his last name means. And those of you who visited Pisa will no doubt have noticed that there is a recurrent architectural decorative theme in the three structures, namely the sequence of rounded Gothic arches along with the horizontal alternating stones of different colors. And this alternation of stones in two colors became one of the main characteristics of what still today is called the Romanesque Pisan style, as this style has inspired several other cathedrals throughout Italy. Now, the inside of the cathedral has 5 naves, and the transept, that is the horizontal part of the cathedral, with 3 naves. And the spatial effect is similar, as you can see in the picture, to the effect obtained inside the great Islamic mosques, thanks to those pointed arches and to the alternation of black and white bands. The dome of the cathedral, that too is of Islamic inspiration. And for the record, inside the cathedral, the 2 Corinthian columns shown here are the original transported from Palermo during the imperialist expedition that we spoke about earlier on at the beginning of the show. The baptistry, as you can see in the picture, has a circular base or footprint and is built on a virtual axis which extends from the entrance of the cathedral to the entrance of the baptistry. Today we would call it an axis of holiness. And the decoration mirrors the facade of the cathedral itself. Again, we have blind arches at the base as in the cathedral, and on the second level the same pointed arches, and on the third level the so-called mullioned windows, which are types of windows that are found frequently in Gothic buildings, especially in Venice, but also throughout Italy and France. Again, they are of Islamic inspiration. The word mullion, by the way, describes a vertical column between the lights of a window. This is why they're called mullioned. Now, the Middle Ages had a special fascination with numbers, and the diameter of the baptistry is the same as the distance of the baptistry from the cathedral. Inside the baptistry there are remarkable works of art, as for example this baptismal font dated to 1246 by a sculptor from the city of Como called Guido Bigarelli, for the record. And particularly stunning is the pulpit by Nicola Pisano, dated to 1257. And given here, however, a short description of the pulpit, we should always keep in mind that at the time when these magnificent works of art were created, reading and writing were confined to relatively few people. Therefore, cathedrals, churches, baptistery, cemeteries, and chapels constituted altogether an immense library in stone, and were designed to inspire a sense of harmony, which they do still today. The idea being that the visitor would both learn, or at least be reminded, of biblical and evangelical events, of which he may hear in church, while the impressive and yet very harmonious architecture was intended to give a hint about the perfection of the heavens. And we should remember that the Pisa complex was built 300, 400 years before it began to be accepted that the earth was not the center of the universe, that the earth circled around the sun and not the other way around. In the older type of cosmic vision that went back to the Greeks, to Pythagoras, the celestial bodies, as they moved in space, produced harmonious sounds that the humans could not hear because due to the imperfection of their sense of hearing. And they moved the celestial bodies inside 10 spheres, each corresponding to a particular musical note. And together, all these sounds produced a literally heavenly harmony that could influence the soul of man, even if, as I said, we could not hear it because of the deficiency of our hearing system. Now, sacred architecture was also intended to reproduce the essence of the harmony of the heavens. But enough of medieval cosmogony. But I said this to explain why so much beauty and detail went both in the construction and in decoration of the cathedrals and places of worship in general. But returning to the pulpit of Nicola Pisano inside the Baptistery, the pulpit, as you can see in the picture, is sustained by 6 marble columns, 3 of which rest on the back of 3 lions, while the central column rests on 3 atlases, or also called telemons, for those who are interested in architecture. A telemon had the same function of the lions who kept up the columns, but a telemon was a man rather than a beast, or a lion, or another animal. Now the banister of the pulpit contains 5 panels with sculptures illustrating the life of Christ, as, for example, the universal judgment. For the record, the baptistry was used not only for baptism, but also for other kinds of ceremonies. For example, from the ordination of knights to the nomination of elders who would be in charge of various supervisory function inside the city of Pisa. The pavement in the baptistry, as you see in the picture, also shows the patterns repeated on the facade and inside the cathedral, with the alternation of black and white stones in regular bands. Pisa's baptistry is the largest in Italy, with a circumference of 352 feet and a height of 180 feet. Now, one of the most curious characteristics of the baptistry has to do with its echoes, made possible by the structure of its dome. And the echo is such that one man can generate one complete chord of 3 notes, creating quite an eerie effect, giving the sensation, if you like, of transporting the listener back in time, thanks to a virtual time machine. I will play it here, and while you can perhaps imagine to travel back in time for 800 years.
Oh
this time to speak about the most iconic, as we said, the most iconic of the icons in the Pisa famous square, also known as the Square of the Miracles, the Piazza dei Miracoli. This is, of course, the Leaning Tower, known originally as the St. Mary's Bell Tower. It is one of the most visited monuments worldwide by tourists who undertake the climbing of the 294 steps leading to the top. Those who have climbed those steps may recall the slight feeling of discomfort, for some even mild nausea, due to the perceived oscillation of the tower, which luckily does not oscillate at all. But that feeling is due to climbing on an inclined surface, which is both oblique and helicoidal. So you have two effects at the same time. The tower was founded on a marshy land subject to subsidence, that is to sliding under pressure. And the construction, in fact, lies on the bed of an ancient river called the Auser. And why did they choose that spot, you may ask? Positionally speaking, it was the best location actually for an isolated building of great symbolic value, from which, as those who have been there will confirm, from which they can to admire the city of Pisa and the complex and the establishing we could say today a kind of architectural dialogue. To aggravate the problem, the helicoidal staircase on the outside is larger than usual, thus weighing heavily on an already precarious balance. The construction began in 1173, and the recognized architect and designer was Diotti Salvi, who also designed the Baptistery. In fact, there is close architectural symmetry, if you like, between the Baptistery, as you can see in the picture, and the tower. The tower began to lean quite early during the constructions, actually when they got to the third floor. In fact, they stopped and they started again in 1132, that is 60 years after they halted the constructions because of the leaning. However, it must be said that builders were not much troubled by the shifting of the foundation, which caused, as we know, as the leaning of the finished product, we could say today. There are three others leaning tower or bell towers, if you like, inside Pisa, though not as well known as the most famous of all. To remedy the situation, the builders adopted first an empirical solution, that is to deform somewhat the cylinder of the structure, thus loading more heavily the foundations on the structure on the opposite side of where the sinking had taken place. Besides, the top cell, the one that should have housed the bell, would compensate for the leaning by making the wall higher on the side where the tower was leaning. Originally, the project included a dome to cover the tower, but in the end, the builders decided it was more prudent. It was more prudent not to stretch their luck. Luck has always, as we probably agree, has always been an important ingredient of just about everything. Luck, of course, is never guaranteed, but in the Middle Ages, they took precautions, a kind of insurance against bad luck. One way to do so was to use some imaginary animals represented typically in capitals or frescoes to drive away the devils or the evil spirits. The accurate term is apotropaic, an apotropaic animal meaning an animal that averts evil, and similar, if you like, to the idea of the rabbit's foot hanging on a keychain. The sculptor Biduino put some of these apotropaic animals, as you see in the picture, in the band surrounding the tower at the base. And he, Biduino, that is, is also the sculpture of these two ships approaching Pisa, whose signature signal, we could say, whose signature is the tower, the signature signal of Pisa. During these past 1,000 years, 1,000 years actually, it is very strange, it's the very strangeness of the tower that has given rise to a myriad of speculations. In the 1800s, for example, researchers believed that the leaning of the tower had been intentional, and they cited as a reference, for example, the so-called sacred wood of Bomarzo, north of Rome, built by the Orsini family around 1550. It was a kind of static medieval Disneyland. And this wood is filled with monster animals, of which you can see here some examples. And in particular, you will find there a leaning building that gives the impression of being ready to collapse at any moment. But in 1838, an architect by the long-sounding name of Alessandro della Ghirardesca demystified the myth of the purposed inclination. And excavating around the base, it was possible to see that the foundations themselves were leaning. However, this excavation turned out to be a very dangerous thing to do, as the water flowing inside the basins of the excavation triggered again the motion of the tower again after a century during which it had been essentially stable. Some viewers may remember that before the tower was opened again to the public, every year the media reported that the inclination of the tower had increased by so many millimeters, and there was ongoing speculation as to the time and year when it would finally collapse. The tower opened again to the public on the 16th of June of the now already distant 2001, after a series of very delicate and critical interventions programmed by two experts of the type of architecture. And they actually succeeded in reversing the inclination by 1 inch and bringing it to the level at which it was in 1838 before the excavation of Alessandro della Ghirardesca. And that is the end of our historical sketch on the Court of the Miracles of Pisa. I am thanking the crew, and in particular our director, Kat Iverson. Thank you for watching. See you next time, and good evening.